I don't think that if you distribute bed nets to protect people against malaria in regions where malaria is a problem and kills children and makes many other people ill, I don't think it's great dependence. People can't live by having a bed net, so they're going to have to work and grow their food or whatever else it might be. It's just that they'll be healthier when they do so, and fewer of their kids will die. So that's just one example. I think there are many others where you can improve people's lives without creating dependence.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Can we justify working for corrupt or immoral institutions as long as they pay well and we donate a considerable proportion to charity?
Again, I think you need to ask what the alternatives are to those corrupt or immoral institutions, and whether by not working for them, and therefore having less money to donate to charity, you're actually going to make those institutions go away or reduce their power and influence, or reform, help to reform them, or whether in fact the opposite is the case, that maybe by working for them you can help to improve them a little bit anyway from the inside, and at the same time earn a lot of money and give a lot away. So I think that there might be cases where you feel you don't want to be involved with something that is so doing so much harm that you really don't want to be part of it, even if giving up means that you have less money to give away. But simply being associated with an institution that you feel is corrupt or immoral on the whole, and again, that might be like the finance industry as a whole. I think that that's too broad a brush. I think that you need to look in more detail. What am I actually doing? What am I actually contributing? Am I working hard to raise more investment in coal mining, for example, which is going to be very damaging for climate change? Maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe that's something I should quit doing. But am I doing something which simply enables my company to anticipate rises and falls in certain commodities and therefore invest in those commodities, not at a level that makes any market global difference, not at a level that puts prices up so that people can't afford them or anything like that, but just at a level that incrementally smooths out the ups and downs of commodity prices, for example. Well, that doesn't seem to be a particularly harmful sort of thing. And then the final point is, as I said, if you go into it, you can maybe make a difference from the inside. If people who think ethically don't go into these industries, they're probably going to get worse rather than better. It's not completely really helping by staying out of them.
Thank you. The next question is, could we justify forced experiments on 100,000 people to cure AIDS, cancer, etc., to cure tens of millions on the basis of utilitarianism, assuming it will be effective?
So could we justify, could mean, in theory, if this were to happen, would one approve it or not? Would a utilitarian approve it or not? And I suppose a utilitarian would approve this in theory. If you could somehow do this and you could cure AIDS and save tens of millions, that would seem to be worth the sacrifice. But things are never that simple. There is a question about how you are actually going to do this in the real world, whether you're going to promote a principle which suggests that it's okay to force people to be victims of experiments, and other people might think that this is a fine thing to do, even if the payoff is significantly less, or even if ultimately there's no real payoff at all because the experiments are not well conceived. And we know that happens a lot when people conduct experiments on animals, that the animals then just become tools for research and not really subjects that are considered, whose interests are considered. So, there is a real danger in accepting the principle that lies behind this, and a utilitarian, of course, should be alert to that danger, because a utilitarian should be concerned about the consequences. So, in short, while in theory this sounds like something that would be a good thing to do, it's not at all obvious that in the real world it is going to be a good thing to do.
Okay, thank you. How can your theory of effective altruism be applied to by states in regard to their development policies?
I think states should also say we have a limited amount of resources, so we should use them as effectively as we possibly can to do the most good. I'm not clear if the question was really asking about states like the United Kingdom, which are affluent states with aid programs, and if so, then I think clearly the same principles apply. If the UK has a certain sum of money it puts into aid, and in fact I know the UK has a couple of years ago reached the 0.7 level that the UN recommended for aid, which is commendable. So you want to use that 0.7% of GDP as effectively as possible. You want to try to measure your impact wherever you can, and think about, are we putting this to programs that will give us the best value for money? The question might, I suppose, have also been about governments in developing countries, and they also ought to be thinking the same way. If they have money that they can spend, and they all have some, then they ought to be using that for the greatest benefit of their people, and particularly focusing on those who are worst off. So, yeah, I think the principle applies in both cases.
Thank you.
So, how can we quantify the amount of good we may eventually cause? Saving lives isn't necessarily good or effective if the quality of those lives is extremely poor.
Yeah, certainly quantification is one of the real issues that needs more work in effective altruism. And it's not just effective altruists who try to quantify. Health economists, for example, try to quantify the benefit of treatments that the National Health Service might fund. And they face exactly the same problem. How do you compare treatments which save lives with treatments that improve quality of life? Really what we need is a way of measuring quality of life. And the health economists come up with this idea of the quality adjusted life year, or the disability adjusted life year, which are not perfect. They're steps towards that kind of measurement. And so to get back to the question, if you save a life and then the quality of that life turns out to be negative, that is, life is so bad that a person would have been better off if they hadn't existed at all, or if their life hadn't been saved, let's say when they were a child, then clearly you've not achieved anything good. But I don't think we should imagine that that is typical of the lives we save through, again, let's use the same example, through distributing bed nets against malaria. I don't think it's proof that the life of a person in sub-Saharan Africa, even someone who's quite poor, is so bad that it would be better if that person were not alive at all. I think that's something of a, we're putting ourselves in that situation, or we're saying, oh, I can't imagine living like that in those conditions that are, don't always have enough food, sanitary, and so on. But I think, in fact, when you look at kind of to what extent are people living in those conditions miserable, it's not like they're constantly miserable. They're quite often they're pretty happy. So I don't think we should have such a negative image of life in extreme poverty, even though it certainly has serious problems. It's not just necessarily below the baseline at which life is worth living.
Great. So why should we help people who will probably never meet, when we can instead help those in our more immediate community?
The short answer to that is that the people we meet in our more immediate community are likely to be a lot better off than the people that we'll never meet, who I would advocate we should help. And there seems to be an assumption behind the question that we should only help people that we know or that we've met or that live in our immediate community. I don't accept that assumption. I think that we ought to be equally concerned about people everywhere. That the suffering matters, whether it's the suffering of a stranger or the suffering of someone I know well the suffering of someone geographically far away or geographically close to me. I think it's, just as we recognize and we reject certain prejudices now, like racism and sexism. So I think the idea that someone is distant from me, the idea that that somehow means that their welfare should count less with me, I reject that. I think that we should think that everybody counts the same, and that the similar amounts of pain and suffering are just as bad whoever they are affected.
How do your views on animal ethics tie in with effective altruism? Should we be working instead to fight factory farming if that could save more lives?
So I think that we can certainly apply effective altruism to working for animals to reduce animal suffering. I think the same principles apply. We should try to get the best value we can for our money, and the more good we can do with whatever we can donate, the better. So animals certainly come in there. The really difficult question that is raised there is how we compare saving the lives of animals with saving the lives of humans, how we compare reducing the suffering of animals with reducing the suffering of humans. And I don't really have an answer to that. I would say that if we're just talking about saving lives, it's legitimate to take into account the fact that some beings have lives that are connected in a way that other beings don't. By connected here, I mean that you think about your past, you make plans for the future, you carry out those plans. It's a biographical life. It's not merely a biological life. And the loss of that life for the being who is conscious of all of that and aware of that is different from the loss of a life for a being who lives in a more moment-to-moment manner, doesn't actually reflect on their past, plan for their future. So I don't think you can just say we ought to save more lives, and therefore, of course, we ought to try to save the lives of animals where we can save more. I think it's reasonable to be concerned about suffering and to try to reduce suffering overall by as much as you can, but the comparison of different kinds of suffering from different kinds of beings is also something that still needs more thought and more work.
Okay, so effective altruism seems to favour easily quantifiable forms of charity. Do you believe the skewed funding away from potentially superior causes that are difficult to quantify?
Yeah, I agree we should not simply assume that only those causes that can easily be quantified are worthy of support. That's the kind of the streetlight effect. You're searching for your keys under the streetlight because that's where you're most likely to find them, even if you didn't lose them under the streetlight. So we do need to try to compare those causes that we can easily measure, like the mosquito nets, with those causes where the effects are more speculative, like advocacy for the poor, for example, is something else. And for that, we need to have some idea of what the probabilities of success are with the more speculative causes and how great the payoff is likely to be. So I suppose what I'm saying is we should be trying to have metrics, have quantification, even in the more difficult cases. And even if the quantification is not very good, we should at least put it out there and allow people to judge for themselves whether they think that's a plausible way of quantifying the payoff that you're likely to get for your donation, allowing for all the uncertainties in the calculation.
Okay, so you talked about all lives having equal value, but that's not what you believe. Do you have a hierarchy of consciousness?
Yes, I don't think I do talk about all lives having equal value. I'm not sure why the questioner thinks that I do. I think that I think that put it this way, I think that every person who has similar interests, every being with similar interests has equal value. I don't think we should, as I said, we shouldn't discriminate between a person's interests, irrespective of whether they're near or far, of whether they're a friend or not. So it's possible that I spoke a little loosely there and talked about lives having equal value. But my thought is really that essentially similar amounts of suffering, similar amounts of pain are equally bad, whoever the being that experiences that. Similar amounts of pleasure or happiness are equally good. But I don't want to say that all lives are equal value. I certainly don't want to say that, well, as I said a moment ago, that the lives of a being who can plan her future and reflect on her past and work for achieving a future that might be some years away, that it's no greater a tragedy if that person is killed prematurely than if you kill a being not at all capable of planning for the future.
Sorry, I think I made some clarification on that. We showed your TED talk, and in that it had the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation page. That says all lives.
Okay. So they say that, yes. I didn't write that for them, and it's a kind of shorthand, I think. I mean, you know, I think I applauded them for putting that up there, because I think that conveys the idea that we should not say that it doesn't matter if millions of kids die from preventable causes, whereas we of course would prevent that if it happened in our own country, or the United Kingdom or the United States. So if I were to be speaking more carefully and more philosophically, I would have to add the qualification that it's not really all lives that are equal value, but it's all interests that ought to get equal consideration where there's similar interests.
Thank you. What is your view on religious institutions, and do you think communities are more charitable or less so without them?
There's some evidence that religious people do donate more to charity, and I mean, that still leaves open the question, are they donating to effective charities as well as people who are not religious? So I think that there is an argument to say that religions encourage people to be charitable, and if so, that's certainly a good thing, a positive point in their favour. I think there are other things about religious institutions that are negative. I think it's negative if they encourage people to believe things without evidence, because that promotes an attitude that I think is often harmful. They're also, you know, often conservative ethically in ways that I think are harmful. They've been, for example, religious institutions that have been the chief opponents of things like same-sex marriage, of allowing people the assistance of a physician to give them aid in dying if they're terminally or incurably ill and want to end their lives. Questions about abortion, which I think should not be illegal. Religious institutions have often tried to keep illegal. And of course, the Catholic Church in particular, and some other religions, still continue to tell people not to use contraceptives, which I think is a highly deplorable thing to be doing.
Thank you. What is the role of love in effective altruism?
Sorry, the pull of love, was that word?
What is the role of love?
The role of love. Okay, so if you want to put it in these terms, you could say that the idea of loving everyone, of loving all humans, or preferably I would say all sentient beings, could be something that leads you to want to help, to want to make a difference to those sentient beings, to all of them. Although I don't think that that's essential, with some people that may be a primary motivator, and that's a good thing. In addition to that, though, I think they ought to be thinking about how to help people the most. So it shouldn't just be love for one individual. It should be thinking about, well, my love leads me to want to reduce suffering in the world, to want to make people and animals better off, and now I need to think how I can do that most effectively. So that's fine if that's the way you come to it. That's perfectly fine. If you come to it without thinking of this in terms of love, but just thinking of it in terms of it's a bad thing that people suffer unnecessarily when that's preventable, then that's another good way of coming to it.
Okay, well, we're thinking you may have already answered a similar question to this, but effective altruism and charity are probably not able to facilitate systemic change as necessary for global development. What place does charity take in development?
So, firstly, I think effective altruism can affect systemic change if it can be shown a route by which that can happen. So, systemic change in the right direction, of course, can make a huge difference. So even quite a small probability of making that difference would justify an effective altruist in working for it. So I don't think there's anything in effective altruism that says we're not interested in systemic change or we're not going to help systemic change. It's just a question of trying to work out what the chances of success are, and if you can find a place to put your lever, then great, go ahead. If you can't, then you still ought to be doing the most good you can, and that may mean accepting that you can't change the system and trying to make the system less harsh, trying to give people better lives within that system.
Thank you. Effective altruism is presumably based upon some form of utilitarianism. What type of consequentialism do you personally adopt?
I don't think effective altruism is necessarily based on utilitarianism at all. There are lots of people in the effective altruism movement who are not utilitarians, and there are certainly some influential people who are utilitarians, but there's no reason, for example, why you couldn't think that there are certain things that you ought never to do, no matter what the consequences. As some deontologists would say, you must never kill an innocent person, but that doesn't affect your everyday life as an effective altruist. You don't have to go around killing innocent people to make the world a better place, fortunately. So I think there's room for a lot of different ethical views that can all give a significant place, a significant role to effective altruism. But to answer the question personally, for most of my career, I've been a preference utilitarian. That means I've argued that we ought to maximize the satisfaction of preferences and avoid the thwarting of preferences. More recently, I've, I guess, thought that some of the reasons why I held that view were not valid, and in my most recent work in which I discussed this topic, which is a book called, a co-authored book called The Point of View of the Universe, my co-author and I lean towards classical hedonistic utilitarianism. So we're talking about maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering.
Thank you. A sort of related question on moral philosophy still. Why should we not be selfish egoists?
Yeah, that's one of the big problems of moral philosophy, is whether you can have arguments against egoism. I think that there are a number of different kinds of arguments you can have. One thing, again, in that book, The Point of View of the Universe, that we tried to do was to show that those selfish desires are likely to have been selected by evolution. If our ancestors didn't act selfishly, they probably would not have survived and left offspring, so we wouldn't be here. But that's not a justification for being selfish. That's, in fact, I think, a debunking explanation. It shows that selfishness is not what a purely rational being would end up with. On the other hand, the idea of being universally benevolent is something that evolution would not select for, but the fact that we still can formulate that idea and that some people can act on it, suggests that this is actually something that our reason leads us to. So there's an argument from the nature of reason, if you like, that leads from egoism to a more universal perspective. I'd also add that I think there are things, empirical things one can say about human psychology, which are that even if in some sense you are an egoist, that is that you want your life to be enjoyable, there's a lot of evidence that people who are generous and care about others do enjoy their lives more than people who only focus on directly trying to promote their own interests.
Yep, okay. So what if the people who are saved by donations cause more harm? Say they are not vegan, for instance.
What we have to hope, I think, is that we help people to get themselves to a position where they have a choice of what to eat, and when they have that choice, then they also have the education which enables them to see why eating animals and animal products, and particularly those from factory farms, is a bad thing to do. So I think that's going to be a long process, but I think that is starting to happen. I think we're getting a lot more plant-based foods being made, and so I don't think the way to prevent that harm happening is simply to allow people to die. I think that's not going to bring about the better world that we want to see. I think rather, if we can get a world in which everybody has as much choice as we do when we walk into a supermarket, then eventually we'll progress to a point where people are not dying needlessly, but they're also not needlessly causing suffering to animals.
Thank you. And we're aware it's approaching time now, so we're going to ask one more question. I hope you'll forgive it for being silly. I experience far more pleasure than the total number of humans that presently exist. Will you send me money to pay for my tuitions?
Yeah, just prove it to me, and sure, I'll be happy to do it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Can we get a round of applause?
Thanks very much, and thanks to all of you who organised this and made it happen, and to those in the audience. I hope you'll continue to follow up. I hope I've answered some of your questions, probably not all of them, but keep thinking about the issue, and I do recommend becoming an effective altruist as a good way to give your life a meaning and purpose that I think you'll enjoy, and you'll be doing a lot of good as well. Thank you. Bye.